everyone. This is update for December 30th, 2024, day 1041 of the war and of the date update. Also catch up for December 29 and 28. I'm gonna do a quick general update, and then I'm gonna switch to situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. I want to talk a little bit about situation between US and China. I haven't spoken about that for a while. Beyond, there's always going on this ever increasing economic war with all the sanctions between the two countries. So that's just sort of at this point sort of normal situation in quotes. Obviously it's not normal, but let's call it normal. But what I think caught my attention is recent speeches by incoming US President Donald Trump, who stated that he wants Panama Canal back, and also Greenland. And what this really means is if you really think, is that US is actually on defensive. And it's being attacked in its own, what's typically called backyard, specifically this whole continent Americas. There is Monroe Doctrine, where US declared at the beginning of the 20th century that all of the Americas are going to be exclusive sort of zone of control of the US. And that really is quickly crumbling and falling apart. And I just want to show you what sort of China did over time, over probably past, I would say, 15 years, plus minus. So China really got control over Nicaragua, very strong control over that specific country. Also, similar strong influence in El Salvador, and then also in Honduras. So essentially, they created this kind of like China economic interest and influence zone, which also means strong political influence zone in Central America. And as you can see, it kind of breaks this whole continuity from the US all the way down south, sort of land connection. No surprise for anyone that China has strong influence and control over Venezuela and Cuba, so that's sort of known. The other parts that are sort of less discussed is that China is getting significant influence and control over Peru and Bolivia. And there's also significant influence over Brazil, but Brazil still, it's a very big country relatively. And so gaining any full control or significant influence is, I would say, nearly impossible. So China is really targeting small countries that allow them to build sort of call it bases in Americas, and then sort of operate from those bases to counter US influence in other countries. So if you really think at this point, most of the Central and South America are either neutral to China or controlled and influenced by China. The only exception is actually Argentina, and that's pretty much it. This is the only sort of pro-Western, very clearly pro-Western part of Central and South America. And that's really, and there is big sort of scare in the US that China will manage to also get influence over Panama and also gain control over Panama Canal. So that's really what's driving this situation. And I would say this is a sign very clearly of weakness, that US is on defensive, even in the area where they used to truly dominate this continent. And so at this point, it's obviously not there. The main reason for this is because U.S. is becoming less and less economically relevant, not only to the rest of the world, but also even to the countries that where used to be very strong economic ties, um, and these countries economically and switching to China, and that's really what drives the rest of it. Then it drives all of the political changes and a political realignment in these countries. And I mean, the reason for that is because manufacturing is essential in China, and China is producing cheaper goods than U.S., and that's really then U.S. essentially has not much to offer, with exception obviously of loans or financial transactions. But at this point, that's also not as attractive, because China can counter that as well. And then China has this economic connection, which again makes it much stronger tie, or at least makes it for these countries to sort of consider other options, let's put it this way. And China is one of such options. And similar situation with Greenland, where there is obviously big sort of concern that China or Russia may gain control. It's probably in that case a little bit, I would say, overblown scare about that. And similar situation with Canada. So what's really happening, instead of naturally uniting these countries around itself, because there is sort of natural attraction of economic relationship, because U.S. essentially destroyed its own manufacturing base, so it has really nothing to offer, no attraction to countries even in the Americas. And so this reflects this whole process, what's really happening essentially. Sort of, as you can see, China and Russia, they sort of want to sort of compare this and how it works with like Russia gaining control over sort of Central Africa, meaning not Central Africa country, but the Central African continent, with help actually of China, where China is supplying weapons to those countries where Russia gets political influence, because Russia right now does not have any spare capacity to supply weapons, so the weapons are being supplied by China. And in Americas, it's much more pure Chinese control. Russia has very little influence, with always the exception Venezuela, Cuba, but that's pretty much it. Russia historically doesn't have good sort of connection, good relationship, with exception as again Venezuela, Cuba, and then obviously Nicaragua. But right now, these countries are much more aligned with China, just because, again, for the same reason, China has goods to offer, right? Russia does not have anything to offer. They, in some ways, they competing as a supplier of natural resources, and so there's no real attraction again between Russia and Americas. So this is hopefully explains a little bit in a nutshell what's going on with this the recent moves by the incoming president, where he wants to unite Canada with the U.S., then Greenland, then Panama, and so on. That's really driven by that. And then there is another, I guess, realization in the incoming president administration that they inheriting really huge financial economic problem. And I think realization of that gets, I would say, to extent makes makes this incoming president and people in his administration panic, to the point that incoming president is mentioning about 1929 type of depression again and so on, which is again what I was discussing before. The amount of debt, the interest payments are becoming out of control in the US, and sort of that was sort of it's being known that that was enormous. It's a problem and so on, but yet there is incentive to continue this status quo and continue growing debt. The trigger that essentially starting to unravel the situation is increasing interest rates, and then obviously increasing interest rate payments to service that debt, which are becoming impossible or unbearable, or they're heading in that direction. And everybody who really thinks on looking forward start to realize that that time is coming relatively soon, and it's going to happen during this new administration time. I'm not saying it's happening in 6 months, but probably very, very, very likely it's happening in 2 years, and that's going to be a very big, huge problem. And in some ways, this new administration is between a rock and a hard place, because if they want to solve this problem, they need to cut expenses, and they need to cut at least 2 trillion and probably more. And I showed this budget statements from the U.S. Treasury. That's really their only way to cut it is to really cut medical expenses, and that's really going to be extremely unpopular in the U.S. obviously, and that also will create small depression, hopefully short depression-like situation economically, because if you stop supplying money to these industries, they will have to lay off. There will be mass layoffs in medical area, and so obviously that will create domino effects throughout the entire country. And because GDP is simply your expenses, or how much you spend money, that's really what GDP is. And so if you cut your expenses by 2 trillion, your GDP is gonna go down. You're gonna shrink, and you're gonna have severe recession and more sort of potentially depression-like event, which shouldn't technically, if economy left to its own devices, it will take care of it, and it will be resolved fairly soon, let's say in a year. Obviously, if there is meddling, that can last like a decade, like exactly how it used to be in the US in the 30s, which is depression was more or less permanent until World War II started. And by the way, we can draw parallel again. The same was actually, even though we all didn't feel this way, but since 2008, again, that problem was not resolved, and so it was essentially papered over. And so in some ways we basically getting to the point where that problem will have to be resolved, and it was sort of snowballing since 2008. And by that I mean it's a global problem. It's not US. It's despite all of this discussion about countries becoming sort of more sort of separate from the rest of the world, it's still a very global world, and it's still one financial system that glues everything together. And that financial system is really driven or is based on the US dollar. And so going back to the situation, that this whole basically all of these problems has been accumulating since long time ago, but more specifically 2008, and they will have to be resolved. And I don't think there is a vision or understanding how to deal with that. And that really makes people in the new incoming administration to panic, because no matter what you do, you have to make unpopular decisions, and so far, obviously, this new president was campaigning on the idea that it's going to be magic wand and things going to get better without any difficulties, and that's obviously not realistic. Things don't happen that way, and so there will be probably significant disappointment when population will realize that either nothing is going to get done and things going to basically get worse, and there will be higher inflation and more problems. So basically escalation on what was going on, or there will be attempts to solve the problems, which will create painful situation for some people, and I would say pointing specifically in the medical field, and more so administrators in basically bureaucracy in the medical field. I wouldn't say that it's a problem of too many doctors. There's certainly not too many doctors. It's a problem of outgrown bureaucracy in the medical field, and in pretty much it's everywhere, but it's especially grotesque in the medical field. And so that's where it's sort of heading in the U.S. Now let's switch to the situation in Ukraine, and I'm gonna do a walkthrough over battlefield in a clockwise fashion, the way I always do it, starting from very north, jumping to the situation in the Kursk region, where Ukrainian forces continuing to lose territory. So this bridgehead is shrinking by day, fairly slow, but nevertheless shrinking. I want to mention about this North Korean troops. So far, I would say there's no objective factual evidence that supports idea that North Korean troops are actually participating or actively and in large numbers participating in any sort of fighting. So far, this is all essentially not supported by any objective evidence. Doesn't mean that's at the same time. It's very clear. There's very clear military cooperation. There's military treaty between North Korea and Russia. However, the way it works is different than sort of being pushed in the mass media. Let's put this way. Now let's look at the situation northeast of Kharkiv. Things remain more or less the same. This is definitely not a priority at this moment for a Russian command. At the same time, Kharkiv is I would argue, most strategic place in Ukraine that Russia would like to get. It's even more important than capturing rest of Donetsk region, or even capturing Zaporizhia region. Kharkiv is extremely strategic city in Ukraine. Now let's look at the situation on the Lugansk front line. Things actually somewhat stable, and the reason for that is not because Ukrainian forces somehow got better and morale improved and they able to conduct defensive operations. None of that is happening. It's really just a function of Russian forces putting less pressure, and that's really what drives this relative stability for now. How long it's gonna last is nobody knows, and really is again driven by Russia. Now let's look at the North Donbass front line. The northern sector remains fairly stable, quiet. In some ways, it reminds the Zaporizhia front line, where in the situation along the Dnipro River, where pretty much nothing is happening. Somewhat similar situation in the southern part. There's still fighting going on in Chasiv Yar, and actually Russian troops managed to capture central railway station in Chasiv Yar. So there is some losses by Ukrainian side. At the same time, the overall situation remains fairly stable. Again, driven everything by Russia, and again, lack of resources on the Russian side to continue active operations. Now let's move to the central Donbass section of the front line, where things actually active, where Russian command is still putting active pressure. The only area is actually where this pressure is this area from south of Pokrovsk all the way to essentially north of Kurakhove. Everything that's sort of south of Kurakhove to Velika Novosilka is on pause by Russian command. Don't have really good explanation. Could speculate all day and next 24 hours, but it's very clear for some reason there is a pause in activity. And let's just look at what's going on in the south of Pokrovsk all the way to Kurakhove. So essentially, and again, the pressure is somewhat subsided as well. But the key sort of area is this between Vovkova and Uspenivka, where at this point Russian troops are advancing towards Udachne and Kotlyne. So basically, they're advancing where I'm showing with the arrow. So the fighting is going on in the fields here. So it's hard to actually sort of pinpoint anything here, but sort of at this point, Russian troops advancing towards Kotlyne and Udachne, and that's really the main and the most dangerous advance by Russian troops, and it continues. There is some pressure in advance towards Chunishino, sort of straight north towards Pokrovsk, and there is some pressure around Novoyelizaveta and Yasinovo. So essentially, Russian command is continuing to build this this bulge of peninsula or whatever you call it, and continuing to advance it. And that's really where they spend resources at this point. Again, very unclear of what's going on the Russian side in terms of general pressure has subsided. Situation sort of south of Kurakhove remains more or less stable. No major Russian advances towards Ulakli. Shevchenko is fully controlled by Russian troops. Again, some pressure, but it's not strong enough to allow Russian troops to really make a sort of final move. As you can see, it's essentially it's almost there in terms of pocket. Nevertheless, for whatever reason, Russian command is not sort of putting sort of last nail in the coffin essentially at this point. And then things all the way from let's say Zelenivka to Novy Kamar and Velika Novosilka, it's fairly quiet at this point. Now let's look at the situation along on the Zaporizhzhia front line. Again, things are quiet here. There's not much going on. And then situation along the Dnipro river remains stable, the same. No new Russian attempts to establish bridgeheads on the western bank of the Dnipro river. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye-bye.